Yeah, sorry. Okay, well, we're gonna get started. My name is Tom Leonard. I'm Senior Fellow and President Emeritus at the Technology Policy Institute. And welcome to our session where we're going to discuss Techlash, is it real, and what to do about it. It was really just a few years ago that Silicon Valley could do no wrong. Tech companies were celebrated for producing great goods and services that were virtually unimaginable only a few years earlier. But this utopian vision has turned sharply dystopian in the span of just a few short years. Tech companies are now accused of being responsible for a host of ills ranging from abuse of market power to violating their users' privacy, to political bias, facilitating election meddling, terrorism, hate speech, and even mass murder and genocide. And they're even being bashed by presidential candidates, a real measure of the importance of the issue. On the other hand, however, major tech platforms and their services have become and remain an integral part of people's lives, and there's no indication that that is changing. And it's unclear what effect the supposed Techlash is having on their profitability. And 50% of Americans still view tech companies positively. That's down from about 70% a few years ago, but it's a larger percentage than generally view other large corporations favorably. We have a great panel here to discuss these issues. Their detailed bios, I think, are available elsewhere, but I'll just briefly introduce them. James Cooper is Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Program on Economics and Privacy at George Mason University at Scalia Law School. He recently spent a year at the FTC as Deputy Director for Economics at the Bureau of Consumer Protection. Bruce Mehlman is the founder of Mehlman, Castanetti, Rosen, and Thomas. He has a wealth of experience on tech public policy issues in a variety of roles. And he was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology Policy in the George W. Bush administration. Randy Picker is James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, where he is doing a lot of writing and speaking on privacy and competition issues. And Catherine Tucker is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management and a Professor of Marketing at MIT Sloan, where she's also doing a lot of writing and speaking on privacy and related competition issues. So we're gonna talk. I'm just gonna start asking questions, hopefully generate a conversation amongst the panelists, and then throw it open to the audience. So the first question is the Techlash real? Let me start with Bruce. Is the Techlash real?
Well, there's a little bit of it depends who's asking. If you're Facebook, oh yeah, or Google, I guess I'd see it a couple of ways. First, when we call it a Techlash, the companies that are most under fire is not all tech. It's not the HPs, it's not the Dells, it's not the Oracles. It's Facebook for sure, it's Google, it's Amazon increasingly. Every couple of weeks, Uber gets in the news for the wrong reasons. So first, the harshest of the lash is against companies who either have behavior or very, very dominant positions that are facing pushback, but a whole lot of tech companies are not. In fact, for the majority of tech companies, certainly that we work with, policymakers remain eager to know how can we help win 5G? How can we help deploy quantum or AI in ways that help more people? So observation one is it's narrow as to specific companies that are most under fire. Observation number two, that said, we're in a broader societal era. It's why you have populism succeeding all around the world, including in the United States. if you look from 1989 until 2009, we were in an era of hyper-globalization where Fukuyama described it as the end of history. That was the title of his book. We're in a backlash against a lot of assumptions that we had during that hyper-global period. As a result of inequality is at record high, the tech is no longer an unadorned, unalloyed, always positive. When Caprio and I were lobbying in the old days, the policy of the U.S. seemed to be what was good for the internet is good for America. Now people get the joke. Well, it's mixed, and automation has positive sides, but we've got to think about the other sides. Privacy is not particularly considered, and so I do think there are genuine policy questions in the United States, and we're years behind the Europeans who are asking a lot of them, and then Asia's a whole different kettle of fish. But I will stop for now.
That's good. So, Catherine, do you think the Techlash is real?
So, I really like that point, that one of my biggest frustrations with the tech debate as it stands is this tendency to bundle all tech platforms into being some single conglomerated mass of Amazon, Uber, Facebook, Google, all mushed together. And I think, not only is it right to say that, look, technology is not just those firms, but I think I'm also a little bit wary about embracing the label of Techlash or using it as a call to action or cry to arms, because again, that's making the same mistakes as some of the people who offer critiques of tech platforms, that somehow there's one label that can explain everything that's going on. So I think it's real, but I'm resisting your label, if that makes sense.
I didn't invent it, but James?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo both what Catherine and Bruce said. I think it's absolutely right that it seems to be focused on, I mean, there's a broader context of populism that's going throughout the world. And I also think to call it the Techlash is way too broad, in the sense that it seems to be focused on large companies, in particular, and that in some ways this is, thinking from an historical antitrust perspective. I mean, this is really kind of just, it's picking on the big firms in the same way you go after IBM or you go after Microsoft, and now it's Amazon, Google, and Facebook. They're the large firms. So they just happen to all be tech, but to think of it as Techlash. I would also say, and I guess I would defer maybe to Bruce or others about politics, but I think about, and I suppose that this is more about the origin or some of the roots, and maybe I'm getting ahead of the panel, so I could stop now and wait and let Randy weigh in.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering about, and I'll get back to you for this question too, but I'm wondering about, to the extent there is a Techlash, what are its manifestations? And what I'm thinking of there is, are consumers using platforms less, or are they using them differently? Have the company's profits suffered? And then the secondary and perhaps a related question is response by government, which you've been saying, James, is basically at least one manifestation is that they're being looked at more closely by the competition agencies.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Right. Randy?
So I do think it's interesting. So I thought the differentiation point that Bruce and Catherine made is clearly right. Even the big firms, I think, are interestingly different. But it's also, I think, fair to say that if you go down the list of firms that Bruce was talking about, those aren't the really big firms, right? If you look at the top 10 by market capitalization, it is the firms that are receiving so much attention in this Techlash. So that's Apple and Amazon and Google and Facebook. Those are the companies. And those companies, look, if you say Oracle to people on the street, I don't know what they think. The other companies that we're talking about, people have in their hands multiple times a day. Now, and the Techlash, I want to say, I almost think Amazon's the most interesting example of that. Amazon is huge. It's also 40% the size of Walmart. So Amazon's sales revenues are like roughly $233 billion last year, an enormous number growing rapidly. Walmart's 510, right? So the idea that when you think about dominance in retail, you focus on Amazon first and not elsewhere. And so many of the practices that Amazon's facing questions about are practices that Sears started in like 1927. So it's not as if the practices themselves are necessarily new. That's the sense in which I think the lash part of a Techlash is sort of interestingly real, in the sense that it's, I think, disproportionate maybe to the moment, in the sense that many of these practices are very, very familiar. And at least in the case of Amazon, it's not the biggest firm in its space.
So, I mean, I mentioned a bunch of things at the outset about things that people say about the large tech platforms, and that they talk about as problems. Privacy is obviously high on the list. I don't know what's at the top of the list. Market power, competition concerns, fake news, election meddling, facilitating the dissemination of bad ideas.
Why would there be a lash?
So what are the major? I mean, how would you rank these things in terms of what's on people's what is of concern and what is of legitimate concern? Which of these reasons is valid?
Well, I mean, to me,
I mean, for example, is there, obviously, you read articles every day saying there's a market power problem, but is there really a market power problem? Is there really, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about the manifestations or where, you know, I focus on, I just came back from the FTC, and that's kind of where my role has been centered on, both consumer protection and antitrust for most of my career. What's interesting is I think you see the two merging together, and into this sort of, you know, my concern, or I think about these manifestations, is it's, from an antitrust perspective, it seems a return to the bad old days of big is bad and kind of incoherent antitrust policy, from which we were rescued in the 70s and 80s by, you know, a large bipartisan consensus embracing the consumer welfare standard and really marrying up economics to antitrust analysis. I mean, you can't be an antitrust attorney without knowing some economics, and the two, because the case law and antitrust and economics go hand in hand. And now I worry that they're starting to kind of come apart. Because you see the merger in, for lack of a better word, some kind of stew or monopoly broth type arguments that, for instance, and you see this explicitly in Europe, not here in the US, but you see with the Facebook decision, the German Facebook decision was recently stayed, but the Bundeskartellamt said, you know, they're big, they collect data, the data through indirect network effects allows dominance, which means there's no choice for consumers, which is how they can collect data. It's kind of the circular argument. And you see some of that around, you see that bandied about here in the United States. Also, there was testimony last week on Capitol Hill where certain commissioners from certain antitrust agencies were saying things like that. And so that's kind of my concern, because I mean, look, antitrust, there are disagreements at the margin. Economics, you know, good economics can lead to differing opinions over whether conduct is competitive or anti-competitive. But what I worry about is they're not theories. You know, I mentioned the big is bad. Microsoft was in the crosshairs, but you can agree or disagree with the outcome of how those came, but they were coherent economic arguments dealing with exclusive dealing or bundling or tying. Here, there doesn't seem to be some sort of coherent antitrust theory, and so my concern is that in this rush to condemn these firms, we're going to try to find these theories and undo a lot of the good that I think has been done over the last 30 or 40 years in antitrust.
So I'll just pick up on that and talk, you know, two experiences I've had. The first one is it's interesting how antitrust measures are being used potentially as a way of reflecting concerns about something completely unrelated to antitrust. And so, for example, in Australia, I was part of these recent antitrust hearings surrounding Facebook and Google and some idea of a referral market to news. But it wasn't really an antitrust discussion. Instead, it was a discussion about the survival of newspapers, especially in a country which has had a history of a long-standing and strong broadcast industry, and how you can really bolster that in the face of digitization. And so that was, again, it was talked about as antitrust, but it wasn't really antitrust concerns. And similarly, when you're in Europe, what's interesting there is, I think James did a wonderful way explaining the sort of circular data arguments. But there what I'm seeing is that because people have natural privacy or surveillance concerns in Europe, you're trying again to make it an antitrust issue. And one thing which frustrates me as an economist is that you hear arguments about whether or not data can give rise to network effects in a way which is just simply incoherent from how we've always talked about them in terms of economics. And what's usually meant is economies of scale or scope. But I guess economies of scale or scope are just not sexy enough, so we have to call them network effects.
Yes. I think they're sexy. I'm just going to say.
You think that, yes.
But I'm an economist.
The
so.
economists here think that's sexy, but you know, but again, we're trying to find economic words, right, which are, you know, and label something as antitrust when really we're trying to address something different.
I guess I think when we were talking at
Yeah.
the table about Germany a little bit, I do think the German Facebook decision is idiosyncratic. I think they're sort of almost self-acknowledging that there are specific privacy issues in Germany, and that the framing of that wasn't a traditional antitrust decision. And as someone mentioned, it's on appeal, obviously, in the German system and has been stopped temporarily, and I don't know where that'll go. So I do think that's distinctive. I do think the other piece of this, though, that's going on here is we are, you know, trying to figure out exactly how we want to talk through these economic issues of two-sided markets. And that's obviously been going on now for a while. And it's not as if two-sided markets are new. Advertising markets, I always say, well, look, we had these exact markets in the 1920s when we were getting free over-the-air radio. We didn't have the privacy concerns, but we certainly had the same way of thinking about it. These were free goods. How should we think about market power in those circumstances? I'm curious to hear what the panel thinks about the privacy issues in the sense, I want to say I think there are ways we can talk about those as antitrust people. Are we seeing firms getting the amount of data they would be getting in competition or not? And so I don't know that it's not amenable to traditional antitrust tools. I do agree with James. I think that there's an eagerness to say privacy and shun those tools or push those tools to the side. And I don't know, are you an economist or not?
Nope.
I think the three of us at least are economists. I'm a lawyer too on the panel, and so reluctant to see economics go away very quickly. But maybe that's just self-protection.
Yeah, well, I'm in complete agreement with Randy and Catherine on that. Let's make sure that economics is front and center in any regulatory inquiry.
Okay.
Required consulting and all that stuff, right?
Okay. That's fine.
Maybe because I'm freed from an economics degree, or just to mix it up, I may disagree with my panelists a little bit. I think these are the droids we're looking for. I think
funny.
that Google and Amazon.
See what I just did? I did the hand wave thing. So.
I think they're pretty dominant players, and I totally think James's point is helpful. It's on both sides. That there's not a coherent economic theory. I'm not an economist. I have a history degree, and there wasn't a coherent economic theory in the Gilded Age. You know, when new economic players were able to get into dominant positions. Without a doubt, as a consumer, I'm not paying anything in cash, but maybe I'm paying something in data. I think it's a worthwhile question to look at. And Tom, you'd asked the question, what are the policy areas, and are they all kind of made up by haters? And I don't think so. I mean, I tried to characterize the policy areas. There are 5. There's market power inquiries where antitrust, data portability, and the ability of the big dominant players to force IP sharing or concessions from other folks. There's consumer protection where, I mean, I don't see how you can't say there aren't privacy questions or digital addiction questions or data security questions. There's platform liability. I'm sure we'll get to 230, where that's probably the hardest issue we've got, because both sides are right, except the Dems want more censorship and the Republicans want less censorship, and they're both right, which creates a huge problem if you have a platform. There's security and nationalism questions, whether it's trade or supply chain or encryption. Again, very legitimate policy questions, but not simple. And then the fifth is the social compact, where you're seeing a little bit of the tip of the spear with European tax authorities in particular, unhappy that there are so many consumers in Europe and so little tax revenue, and trying to grab at some of the tax. But you're seeing with automation, you're seeing in California with that horrible AB 5, when companies become the big, most important players, often as reflected by their market cap, certainly as reflected by their ubiquity in our lives. You try to get off the Google grid and see how it goes. It's going to raise policy questions. It should raise policy questions, and it's not a societal problem if we're asking ourselves, do we have the balance the way we want it? The risk for me is that there is this, the populists on the left have met the populists on the right in bashing tech, and that we're going to go totally overboard with efforts to get Facebook that create policy shrapnel that undermine new startups. And that would be a shame. And if you look at what happened with GDPR, it's kind of seemingly what's happening over there.
Well, let me try to ask a basic question, which we're kind of skirting around. If the tech, even if these large tech companies are a problem, then presumably that would be because they are causing, or their activities are causing harms to consumers, and just in the economic realm and non-economic realm. And presumably policies should be aimed at addressing some concrete harms. So the question is, to begin with, what are the harms that we might want, that policymakers might want to address?
Well, I actually thought what Catherine said about newspapers in Australia was interesting. So I think what's happened there is that newspapers survived in a world in which the transaction costs of accessing news were high. And it meant that they weren't competing across the globe with everyone, and now they are. I can get the BBC as easily as I can get the Chicago Tribune. And so in that world, the separation is gone. And then the question is how do you survive pricing for a zero marginal cost product? And I think that's just a hard problem. And I think it's driven by the existence of the scale of these intermediaries. But I don't think, other than the fact that that system is incredibly efficient, that they're causing it. And then we have to ask a separate question, which is sort of what they're asking in Australia and other places, certainly in Europe as well, which is, well, if that's the problem, if news as we know it, and the funding mechanisms are dying, what's our fix to that? Do we regard that as a problem? And I do, just so we're clear. And what's the fix to that?
Yeah, it's actually interesting you talk about the news, and I hadn't really thought about this before I answered Tom's question.
You're not saying you're saying there's a plethora of news.
I am.
So
That's now readily available
it's not
because of the
readily
internet.
available. I mean, if there is a problem, presumably it might be that very localized news is not available. But in terms of general, and I'm not even sure that's true, but is it a problem for people, or is it just a problem for the newspapers?
A problem for society? I mean, that
Well,
was where
if
Bruce
there's
took us.
if there's a
So
plethora
I don't
of
have
news.
I don't care about the existence of Tribco or whatever they're calling it these days. I do care about whether local news is financially sustainable. Yeah, okay.
I'm just gonna say it's interesting. When back in, I guess it was 2009, when John Leibowitz took over at the FTC, that was one of the first things. So that was 10 years ago, looking at how the internet's impacting the news, and whether we should use Section 5 authority that way. That didn't take off then. Well, maybe the time's right, but
I don't know if Section 5 is the right tool.
yeah, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want to put words
No,
in
no,
your
I
mouth
just-
at
no,
all.
I'm just trying
But
to-
I just thought it was interesting
Yeah.
that's kind of if that's what Australia was talking about, that's what we were talking
Well,
about 10 years ago.
What we're talking about in this country is an antitrust exemption for newspapers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
But I was just gonna. You talked about the harms, and I think again, speaking more from the antitrust or consumer protection world, is you should really focus on harms to consumers. I'm worried. I mentioned about how a lot of this seems to be undoing some of the good work that economics have done for antitrust and consumer protection, for that matter. I mean, consumer protection in the 80s at the FTC became much, much more economically coherent, both with the unfairness statement, the deception statement, which married it up a little more with economics, not as closely as antitrust, but at least thinking through costs and benefits in that respect. And so I worry that two things is that when we start conflating antitrust and using, I think Catherine and Randy, you both said this, the kind of that you want to get at a consumer protection problem or a privacy problem, but you're trying to use antitrust to do it. And I think that it's important that both of those legal domains stay in their own lane, because I think they address different consumer protection and competition address different things. And I worry about as we move, this movement seems to be focused more, because it's hard in many cases to identify, or in the antitrust side, when we talk about these, is identify the consumer harm. Unless it's some positive theory in the future that consumers will have, somehow Amazon will take over the world, and then they'll, kind of a Matsushita type argument that 20 years from now they'll be the only game in town, and then they can finally raise their prices, or Google can, or whatever. It seems hard to identify the consumer harm, and I worry that a lot of this focuses on harm to competitors, which is again where antitrust used to be, and very correctly moved away from, is, well, we don't really care about competitors except for the impact that it may have in diminishing competition, which is good for consumers. And we can talk more. I mean, I don't want to about the other possibility of looking at, and this is an analogy that I've written about before that I think breaks down on close inspection, but is often bandied about, is that data is the price we pay, and they can extract all this data, so they're monopolies. And I think there are a lot of problems with that. We can talk about that later if there's time. But
I mean, that leads to the question, because a lot of what politicians and others are talking about is basically an unhappiness with a dissatisfaction with the whole advertising model for these companies, that they think, and I think you saw that in the FTC, some of the testimony of the FTC commissioners last week, but it's pretty widespread around there that there's something fundamentally wrong with the advertising model, and perhaps it should be replaced by a direct payment model. What's your all's reaction to that, Catherine?
Well, I'll go first. So I think the first thing to say is what is amazing about the advertising model is just how these hugely successful firms are supported by a form of advertising which really on the whole doesn't work very well. I think we often have this sense that it somehow must be bad because we're sort of trained as sophisticated people to find advertising somewhat distasteful. It's not very nice. But it's important to remember that online advertising generally is kind of pitiful in its effectiveness. And once you have that, and just to give you an idea of numbers, this is from about 10 years ago, but I think the numbers are probably even worse now, that if I randomly show you an ad or don't show you an ad, the most I'm hoping for is a 3% shift in whether or not you even remember an ad. And when you go down to actually any shifts in behavior, we're talking about fractions of a percentage point. So this is something which just doesn't work very well. So now,
Is this even for targeted?
This is even from target advertising, but this is going to be important. Because when you've got something which is only working very poorly, any improvement to something which is working poorly is going to be huge. And so when you see these huge gains from data, it's just because it's pathetic in the first place, and having data makes online advertising work better from this very low baseline. And I think that's often missed in these discussions, that there's some idea of as you say, there's some kind of dystopia where we're all being manipulated. But the reality is this amazing economy is being supported by something which really doesn't work very well. And the reason we need data in it is because we're shifting the needle fractions of percentage point to make this ineffective monetization form work better.
Well, let me kind of ask the question in a slightly different way. Is there any evidence that consumers would be better off with a direct payment model for services like Google and Facebook?
I don't have any, I'm sorry, Randy.
No, go ahead. I'm skeptical. So, but yeah,
I would
I'm
be
really
skeptical. This is anecdotal evidence. I was actually on a panel last week or 2 weeks ago, COPPA hearings at the FTC, and there were a lot of, I was on my panel and also on some other panels, there are children's apps developers, and they talked about, so COPPA, not to get too in the weeds, but COPPA in 2013 defined persistent identifiers cookies as PII, which basically shut down the ability to behaviorally target for kids' apps and kids' websites, kid-directed content online. And there are several app developers, one in particular on my panel, who talked about exactly that. Like, I had to go behind the paywall, and the number one complaint he gets from consumers is why you have an adult app that is advertised and supported that's free. Why does my kid have to pay for this app? And so I would suggest that I mean, that's again just anecdotes, but my guess is forced paywall is not Shangri-La.
What you also asked, would consumers be better off? And one of the questions that leaped into my mind was, in exchange for what? So if it goes from free to paid, no, I'm not better off. But if you stop doing something I don't want you to do, or I have more control over my data, maybe
Well,
it's a
if
choice.
it goes from free to pay, but you don't give them your data, yeah.
Well,
that's-
which makes me think of, many of us who use iPhones do so for a variety of reasons, not least of which their privacy practices are meaningfully more consumer friendly than an Android phone. And so, the worry I would have is making that switch, giving me that option is great because I can afford it. And I would worry about, in an era already of extreme inequality that's rising, going to a world where privacy is a right you can afford, but it's not a right you're afforded.
I thought what Catherine said about the advertising was interesting. I mean, there's the famous John Wanamaker line from a long time ago, 50% of my advertising is wasted, I just don't know which half. And it's, that hasn't changed in some basic sense. Now, on your story, what's interesting is why do they spend all this money on the advertising if it's so ineffective? And I thought, and you're so much closer to this than I am, I thought there was a recent Appetising study which said that data gets you an additional 4% or something like that. Is that the figure? Above contextual. Contextual's really great. Is that right?
So I must admit, in my work, it's even higher.
Okay. What's the number
So,
there?
so in my numbers, depending on how personalized the data is, I've seen 4 to 5-fold increases.
Wow.
And so if you're just thinking about that from a return on investment
Huge.
perspective,
Yeah.
let's be clear, it's incredibly ineffective but very cheap.
Yeah.
And so ineffective but cheap can still deliver ROI relative to other advertising forms which are ineffective but expensive.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, Catherine is probably the leading expert on this stuff, and I would say, her empirical research is groundbreaking and has done a lot. So we're lucky to have her on the panel for that reason. Also, kind of collaborating a lot. Garrett Johnson, he's a guy at Boston University. He spoke at the FTC panels on this. He presented some of the research too, and he found very similar things. I think Alessandro's Acquisti's paper that you're talking about,
Yeah.
I think what he was looking at, you're right, I mean, it's tiny, but I think that's how much, at least and I'm not exactly sure where all the data comes from, but that's what the content providers got.
Publishers, yes.
So it also may be an issue over the division of the rents there, right? So it may be 6x, 10x, whatever, but the content providers on average are getting a smaller return of that, and maybe the ad network's taking a chunk. So that's how I read Alessandro's paper, but that's at least what I took away from it.
Okay.
Let me ask a more political question and then maybe go on to real policy issues. Bruce, why would...
Okay.
Just give me the fake question.
That's a real question.
Why are the politicians... first of all, is any of this going to change anybody's voting behavior? And kind of a related question is, why is this now becoming a real political issue, or even a presidential campaign issue?
Well, first, I've never seen an exit poll where somebody said, it was their position on antitrust and data. Maybe if you ask,
We can only dream.
he'll be the Karl Rove of the 2030s. So far, tech policy hasn't been a reason voters go one way or another. And frankly, Dan, I'm thinking back to our decades, which has been nice, because frequently technology policies, the partisanship stopped at the network's edge, and we were able to think about things that might be good for the country as opposed to Team Red and Team Blue. Why have things changed? I think it is a part of the larger growing nationalism, growing populism. A majority of the world feels they're not in the winner's circle and they don't have a shot to be there, and they're concerned by that, and understandably and properly so. McKinsey wrote a paper in January this year. They talked about a superstar economy where the top firms, the top cities, the top sectors, and the top individuals with the right skills and the access to capital have both a commanding lead and are growing that lead faster. But the other piece, there's the responsible politicians. I think of the Rob Portmans leap to my mind, who are genuinely trying to reflect and address concerns of their actual constituents. But there's also the politician instinct to, you need villains. Who are you going to run against? And so a large amount of what we're seeing from the left and the right are more about who they are, tech, not what they do. And so for those on the left, well, tech's rich, they're business, they're the country clubbers. On the right, they're politically correct, they're global elitists, they're university club. Increasingly, it is a useful foil to take your brand of I care about you and the people who don't are, and tech fits that kind of the silhouette cutout that you need your villain to fit. Tech fits for both sides.
For different reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what you were just saying reminded me, there's the late, great Fred McChesney. He was a professor of mine in grad school, and he had this theory, the money for nothing. And it was about, so I have to talk about public choice because I'm from George Mason, right? So I can't not talk about public choice, but we think the normal sort of rent seeking, you go and you lobby, but he took it a step further and said actually that, it isn't just from the bottom up, it can be from the top down, where you say, okay, I passed this really helpful thing to you 10 years ago, Section 230, and maybe I can take it away. And so I just think it's interesting, and I don't know anything about politics. I just, but it kind of sticks into that, like you have this a lot of cudgels over the tech industry right now, a lot of levers, and how much of this is, you said, making it into a villain, or just cynically looking for campaign donations.
Money for Nothing's a song lyric, right?
Yeah, I did. I knew that. I knew Fred McChesney, in fact, didn't come up with that. He was a big Pink Floyd fan, so I imagine that's probably where it came from. But anyway, it just sounded. This story fits in pretty. He tells a lot of stories about that, but this story kind of fits into that. I was thinking.
I guess time will tell. It doesn't feel like a shakedown to me. That might be why the R&D credit was extended 1 year at a time for 100,000 years.
Yeah.
This one feels that the issues are more visceral, and it's politicians finding useful foils to blame.
So, in terms of solutions, I want to start talking a little bit about what people think the companies should do, and what the government should do. Or where the intersection is, and so maybe this also will get into the Section 230 discussion. So what should companies do that they're not doing, either just because it's good business, or it's just good practice, or because it might help stave off government action? Anybody? Randy?
I want to say I don't know, I guess. I mean, I'm curious to know whether they're altering their acquisition strategies right now at all. So obviously when we talk about Facebook, we mentioned Germany earlier, The German result there is what the German competition authority called a internal divestiture. We're going to not break it up formally, but you have to silo the data. And I think that reflects a little bit of a regret about how both the Instagram and WhatsApp mergers played out, both of which received serious inquiry in both the United States and Europe on traditional antitrust tools. And I do think that you get the sense that some people would like those back. So it would be interesting now, whether they're going to slow down their acquisitions because of that. Obviously, Mark Zuckerberg was prominently at Georgetown this past week. Facebook is, I think, in the eye of the techlash, at the heart of the techlash, in a way that even Google and Amazon are not, and obviously Apple, I think, less so, and Microsoft, just cruising along, which must feel like, an unbelievable position given the way the world used to work for them. But Facebook...
Is that somewhat because, or maybe largely because of Cambridge Analytica, one big episode that in some sense was almost, is that a precipitating event for the whole techlash?
I think, as I've said before, I'm a Cambridge Analytica victim. I don't know what that means, right? So Facebook told me that I was. I dutifully noted that. What that meant technically is that one of my friends had used an app and someone had gotten my birthday.
Do you get a cut of that $5 billion?
Yeah, exactly. I somehow have not received a check yet. And that's a context where, Facebook opened up the social graph in like 2007, and from a competition standpoint, in some sense facilitating edge innovation in a way that competition people applaud. And that as we turn to solutions by the government, I think we're going to talk about a variety of non-antitrust mechanisms that look like public utilities style regulation. All of those, I think, will look a little bit like what Facebook did when it opened the network to Cambridge Analytica. And if that's our great problem, I don't get it. I think it's much more this sense that the 2016 election came out the wrong way and that somehow that was Facebook's fault.
Just on the what should companies do, because I don't do regression analyses. I talk to companies about what they should do. A couple thoughts. First, engage earlier. The idea that this will blow over or this is just Facebook's problem is a mistake. Responsible folks get the joke that the next decade is going to be a search for substantive policy reform in and way beyond tech to try to make more people perceive that the economy is working for them, and we likely have a recession somewhere ahead that will complicate that. Two, companies need to understand political risk. There's greater political risk from government as a stakeholder than there's been over the last several decades. In particular, U.S.-China decoupling is not going to end whatever short-term deal they may or may not be cutting right now. I don't know, but it's a decade to 3-decade major challenge. So either you're planning for that and you're thinking about your supply chain, you're thinking about what you sell and where you can sell it and how you have effective regional strategies, or you're going to find yourself behind the 8 ball. You got to find the positives when you're in talking to policymakers. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, what was good for the internet was good for America. We would just talk about how cool we were, and members would fawn over how awesome the innovations are. Now you've got to focus on how you're helping their consumers and their constituents who aren't tech people. In part, thanks to productivity, tech employs fewer people per $1 billion of market cap than it might have 20 years ago. But most constituents, most constituents who are represented aren't in the tech sector. So how are you helping them? There's usually a good story to tell. Tech's not always good about telling it. And then last, tech needs to think about expanding the allies that they partner with and they bring. And you're seeing folks sometimes on social policy issues. You got to be careful. You're not an NGO. You can't narrate every tweet, and you can't decide that your job is to spend all of your time and your energy speaking up for things that aren't related to the company. At the same time, you do have values as a company. I point frankly to IBM as a really great example that they've both worked with the administration on things like the Perkins Act and on workforce for training, which are worth working with anyone on, and they've been a champion on LGBTQ rights and on immigration. And they've managed to be focused and to stay in their lane and to not try to be everything to everyone, but to also recognize that they shouldn't only speak when you have a question about their core business and core competence.
Do you see any need for them to change their business models?
Well, look, the first and foremost, you need to have a business model that succeeds. And so for any company, if you're losing money, you need to change your business model. And if you're making money, to think of our Google, Amazon friends, their business models seem really effective. They've just got to figure out the odds of their business models being made illegal, or maybe they can afford the Vestager fines that they're going to keep getting. They just have to look around the corner as to where the puck's going, and if they want to change their business model, it's because they recognize that the regulation or the rules that are coming will make what they're presently doing impossible. Again, we're still, and I hope we remain, a market economy. So first and foremost, if you're a business, you're either making money in a successful business model, or you need to change your business model. That was Econ 101.
Let me ask a question about various legislative proposals that are on that are being discussed, and whether people think they're needed or whether they think they'll happen. First, privacy legislation. Do we need a privacy law in the United States?
So I'd like to just speak up that what I always find fascinating about this debate is that we're worried about entrenchments of digital platforms. And then we contemplate privacy laws which are guaranteed to entrench digital platforms. So, it's a good, on the one hand, you have these people saying, well, if big data is indeed this big barrier to entry, then we need to encourage data sharing. We need to encourage data portability. We need to make data free. And that's exactly the opposite to what a privacy law is trying to do or guarantee. And so I think as policymakers or a policy body, we need to recognize that there is a trade-off. You can't have privacy regulation, strong privacy regulation, and also have competition. You have to make a choice. And I find it frustrating that we keep on having these parallel conversations and not realizing that they're completely contradicting each other.
But of course, in the real world, it's complicated by the fact that we have California and other states and GDPR. So, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, Randy,
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to answer your first question. Do we need privacy legislation? And I think the answer to that is no. I mean, I think two things. I mean, so I've, again, coming off a year at the FTC and having worked there and been a student of it, look, unfair and deceptive acts and practices really covers everything. It's harm-based, and it covers everything we need to cover. I also think the United States is sort of unfairly pilloried as having ineffective privacy because we didn't have a grand either GDPR before they had the privacy directive. Well, they had that on the books as a national thing, but how many cases were brought? I mean, not too many. The United States, I mean, we have the FTC under Section 5, whether it's deception or unfairness, has brought a whole bunch of privacy and data security cases from the turn of the century through today, including consent orders against all of the largest tech firms. And you've got the sectoral regulation, whether it's HIPAA or COPPA or FERPA or fill in the blank. So the United States, has largely adopted a risk-based program, and in the sense that we look at where data but where we care most about privacy, whether it's health or children's privacy, and we make that a little more strict liability or a little more opt-in. And then we have all the other stuff, the commercial privacy, and we let the FTC handle that under unfair and deceptive acts and practices, which ostensibly is a harm-based, or I lied to you, and you can't, and that's a kind of a fill-in for harm. Now, I haven't always agreed with what the FTC has done, but I don't think, from a policy perspective, we need an overarching national legislation. That said, I think California has made us go that way. And I would defer to Bruce on the politics of that. I think it's unfortunate, but I think things were fine until if CCPA had not happened, I don't think we would be talking about a big privacy legislation right now.
Yeah, so a couple things, I guess. So I agree with Catherine on the privacy competition issue, and I do think the opening up of the Facebook network and the Cambridge Analytica situation really makes that crystal clear. It's interesting to see that a number of the recent expert reports, the Furman report and the like, all by economists, I think, are all in favor of portability, which maybe means economists don't take privacy too seriously. Maybe that's just what the revealed preference is, because that's where those are coming down. I do think we're seeing, and it goes to what James was just saying about California, we're seeing a kind of unbundling of the United States, where the states that are all red, the legislature, the governor, the states that are all blue, the legislature, the governor, those states are on diverging legislative paths. And California, because of its obvious scale, has an effect that matches that. And so I really think the question on national privacy legislation, I don't know what I would think in the abstract. I think in the context of this unbundling, doing that at the state level is not obviously attractive to me.
Yeah, I very much agree with what was just said. Whatever the platonic ideal is, the reality is California has a law that's taking effect. Washington, Massachusetts, New York are all going to race to improve upon it.
Nevada has
Yeah,
one too.
and so what you're going to have, you have 50 different states that have data breach notification laws, and one thing required in Massachusetts is itself illegal in California. And so, good luck. If you comply with everybody everywhere, you'll blow yourself up.
Well, how hard would it be to get preemption into a federal law?
Really hard, but it's the Toxic Chemical Substance Act. Last Congress was passed. It took a couple of years to get it done. There's so many members from California, and it's become a bit of a political red shirt that it's a little bit harder to do. At the same time, if we're up here to talk about sound policy, the internet's a global medium, and we're talking about regulating it at the state and local level. That doesn't seem desirable. That all said, though, even to James's thought, even if, let's say, California were quiet, which is such a nice thing to think, but is so not what the way the world is. But even if they were quiet, do you feel like I'm up with 3 economists? You guys may read the policies you sign up for. It feels, if not a contract of adhesion, I don't think most people know what they've agreed to. I am generally pro-market and anti-regulation, but it would be nice if something caused folks to be a little bit more transparent and a little more understandable. So even if I'm getting all of this awesomeness for free, it was more easily and readily understood, as opposed to just so much tiny print that it's just not worth it. I'm just moving forward.
Well, I think contracts of adhesion are part of everyday life. I mean, I probably signed 3 today. I just got back from a trip. Rental car or whatever. I mean, there are lots of standard form contracts we go through. I mean, I think this goes to a broader issue that we all think that we care a lot about privacy and that survey is really high, but there's this big gap, and it's called those of you in the policy world, the privacy paradox, right? Well, you take a survey and everyone says, yeah, privacy is really important to me. I care deeply about privacy. But when you go out and measure it in studies like Catherine has done and others, whether it's experimental work or field work, it comes out the same, that people are not willing to pay a lot. And all you have to, and there are competing explanations for why that exists. And it's not to say that privacy isn't important, but it's the kind of privacy that we give up when we sign up for an app, so they doesn't seem to be, it's quite different than the kind of privacy if there's someone staring at my kids while they're sleeping, right? And I think we often conflate those two. Another thing that I think gets conflated, and why maybe people don't care, is this data is being gone. It's in theory, great computer scientists can match things together and re-identify. But you have to also look at what are the incentives for someone to do that in the real world outside. And I think that most people, that's maybe why we see this. Now, there are other explanations. Is it asymmetric information? But then you think of rational ignorance, and you think if people really cared, wouldn't entrepreneurs come into the field? If I wanted to use, there are lots of apps and extensions that I can use to keep myself from being tracked, to opt out. They're out there, and people the opt-out rate is probably less than from ad tracking is less than 1%. I think. I could be wrong about that. I'll defer to Catherine on that.
Well, I have more questions, but I'd like to give the audience an opportunity and see if they have questions. And wait for the microphone, so we get you on the recording. Right here. And please identify yourself too and your affiliation.
Sure. Carl Zabel with NetChoice. First of all, with respect to the question of privacy and whether people opt in, Alessandro did a study where he offered people gift cards, and they opted for the more valuable gift card with less privacy overwhelmingly. So that was an example there. But one of the things we started with Tom was he started by saying people love these platforms, and they do. People love Amazon because it gives you 2-day delivery. People love Apple services, and Google and Facebook still is more popular, overwhelming, more than 50% popular. So is this something, this techlash, that people actually care about? Or is it more just coming from legacy industries that have been lost out to tech, or business competitors who just want to stick it to the bigger guys? Is this something that people actually care about, or is it something we're being told to care about by special interests?
It's a good question.
I have no answer to that.
I think it goes, maybe you have to take them one by one. So I certainly think the Amazon situation, there's no doubt that a large part of that is about the third-party sellers. That's not about consumers, right? And Europe tends to listen in those circumstances in a way that we don't in the United States. Facebook and Google, honestly, I mean, the shift of advertising dollars there has been so extraordinary. I think the press finds these issues actually very interesting. And I don't know if that's what you mean by a legacy industry, but maybe you do. And there's no question that they've been hot on these issues. And I note the alignment between their interest in these issues and their business models. I think Apple's a different situation. In part, as Bruce was saying, they've just got a different business model. We don't need your data. We're going to get all your money. So I think they've been less involved in this. So even Apple's starting to face things here and there.
I'd only add, it depends on what we're talking about. So the fact that there are fewer startups today, the fact that the top 100 firms earn now 84% of all profits, and that's beyond tech, as opposed to in 1975, 49%. The average consumer, maybe they feel it, maybe they don't, but I think is the idea of people being upset about either election interference by nuts on the right or election interference by elites on the left, does that piss off people? Yeah. Is that manufactured by Yelp or by competitors? No. It's people who read what actually happened. Efforts by Russia and others to make us all pissed at each other and hate each other. As I'm a parent, I've lived it, I've seen, there is digital addiction. There is. And it's not accidental. It's A/B tested, it's by design, it's baked in. Do we need regulations on that? I don't know. But is that a result of competitors? No. It's a result of parents.
Mike Nelson, just to build on the last question.
The Mike Nelson.
I've been in the IT industry for about 30 years, and FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, has been a constant. But it does seem that it's increasing exponentially. And my question, a three-part question. We're seeing the Russians try to get us scared about 5G. We're seeing total confusion about what is Section 230 and not. Even in the New York Times, there's just an incredible amount of confusion being fed by a lot of the industries companies that were just mentioned, as well as the Russians. Do you have any specific ways that we can improve the policy debate and reduce the amount of FUD, or are we still going to keep seeing an increase in the confusion?
More economists?
More professors in more schools. Yeah, so more of what I do.
Mike, unless I'm misremembering your bio, aren't you an OTA alum?
No.
No. Well, you play one on TV. So Congress is remarkably disarmed when it comes to having any idea what's actually going on. It would be helpful, I think, if they had more analysis and more resources, more economists, send lawyers, guns, and money. It's more economists for sure. I think would be helpful. But when you're the biggest sector and the most ubiquitous in everybody's lives, there's going to be a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. In my experience, and I'm hoping this stays true, most policymakers ran for the right reasons, want to do the right thing, are genuinely interested in learning and trying to be responsible, are praying whatever issue they're working on doesn't appear on 9 p.m. on cable because then it's blown up and made impossible. You take a look at SESTA as an example, and there are discussions about whether or not there are unintended consequences that undermine what they were trying to do. We will learn over time, but Rob Portman and Amy Klobuchar spent a lot of time working and talking to as many folks and building ultimately 97 senators who were on the same side of the issue, trying to cut through fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Maybe they got it right, maybe they got it wrong. As a process, I think it was pretty admirable, however. And I am hopeful that the fear, uncertainty, and doubt makes great copy in the press, makes great slogans on the campaign trail. But I'm still hoping that tech policy itself proceeds by thoughtful, reasoned, data-driven analysis and compromise.
Dan and then this gentleman.
Thanks, Tom. Dan Caprio with the Providence Group. Thanks for a terrific panel. Just wondering, sort of everyone's opinion of where does this all wind up? The last time we really had this much of a conversation about technology policy or competition policy was 100 years ago. It was the election of 1912, and out of that, we had the Clayton Act and the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. So where does this, I know this is a big question, but where do folks see this winding up? We're talking about new agencies, legislation. I mean, we had a long discussion about privacy, but it's real, and where does this land?
It's probably another question for you, Bruce.
I'm happy to keep making up answers, sure.
Yeah.
If I had to make my best guess, tech is a chapter in a book that talks about, I did one of my slide decks I called the Roaring 2020s, which did not catch on. Apparently, it's not nearly as clever as I thought. But I think we're looking at a decade plus of reexamination of the social compact. And there are realities of the 21st century, tech data among them, that are, by all observations, leaving more people behind and more people feeling like they're not able to grab opportunity, which is the hallmark of the United States, than have felt that way before. And it's a global reality. Will tech end up exactly as it is? That's the only thing I know. No. Will we reinvent antitrust and come up with a sense that your data may also that use of your data in ways you either don't know or didn't know you agreed to is consumer harm? Maybe. They're going to re-examine that. But what I do know is if the winner's circle remains the McKinsey superstar economy, we're going to see election after election be a change election. We're going to see politicians railing against the big, global, elite, hyper-educated, and that's tech.
So will we end up with an Internet Commerce Commission, which is what an increasing number of people are proposing? What?
Look, I hate to come to Washington and talk politics because that's not what I do in Chicago. Well, I guess we do, but that's a different discussion. Look, it obviously depends on what happens in the 2020 election. And then I think a practical question about capacity, right? So if the Democrats run the table in 2020, and my former colleague, as it were, in the academic world, Liz Warren is president, right? What will the priorities be? Will court packing be the number one priority? Go down your list. But if they focus on tech, I absolutely think we'll get new legislation, right? Because I think traditional antitrust is a very slow-moving process. If Europe is our model, they've been chasing Google for more than a decade. They've taken a bunch of money. Have they changed competition? I don't think in any meaningful way. They've been chasing Intel for 15 or 16 years, and I'm not sure. So I don't think antitrust is the tool if you want to make changes in the economy rapidly. So I think you'll see new legislation, and whether that's a new commission of the sort that Tom's talking about, I don't know. But I think it's certainly new substantive legislation, and maybe a new commission. Is it a specialized court system to avoid the current Article III courts, which will be seen as controlled by a bunch of conservatives? That's the path I think you'll go down. Again, it's a question of when you really sit down and build a legislative agenda, where is tech in that agenda? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yes.
So my name is Anupam Khanna, and I work on digital economy issues. So when I came here, I was a little taken aback because the three economists seemed to be on one side of coin, or one side of the spectrum, and the non-economist was the other, which was a surprise to me because the people I thought were the most concerned, and amongst maybe I was spending too much time on the West Coast, were the economists who think that something needed to be done. Presumably it's because most of you are sort of economists who've been focusing on antitrust. And within that, more specifically in America, the consumer welfare standard has become the sort of sacred cow. But recent economics papers of very, I think solid economists elsewhere have challenged that. Platform economics, there's lots of it that's challenged that. So my question to you is, do you think it's that economics, what doctrine of economics basically is sort of, let me put it this way, my version of economics today is more akin to what the sorts of things that Bruce has been talking about, where it says basically the Pareto efficiency criterion is no longer sufficient for policy making, and distributional issues have to be at the core. And once you integrate that, political economy makes you take a broader picture than what you have. So specific things, accountability issues, how does platform economics change some of these, I'm talking the most modern one, two-sided matching markets, et cetera, multi-layer platforms. These change some of the sort of accepted dictums. And lastly, intertemporal issues basically means that some of the price, consumer welfare standards needs to be revisited. So don't you think all those need to be revisited?
So I'm happy I get to actually sit one out finally, but it's funny, you're saying you're surprised. I'm an establishment Republican lobbyist and I'm the regulatory guy up here? What the hell is going on?
That shouldn't be surprising these days, right?
No, I said establishment.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry,
I just came back last week from a conference where there were business and economists, and they were basically saying the current situation is untenable. And this was at Stanford Business School.
Maybe it's an East Coast, West Coast thing like rap or something. Like we don't, of course, the Randy's.
Similarity is right there.
Yeah. No, I would say, it just two quick things. One is I think normal antitrust is, look, platforms have been around for a long time. We know, so I don't see just because we have two-sided platforms or multi-level platforms that you need to revise economics or how economics looks at antitrust. It's capable of doing that. Platforms have, So I don't think it needs to be revised. The other thing I'd say is sort of the broader societal distribution issues. Those are legislative issues. I'm talking pretty narrowly here about antitrust or consumer protection law. That's not where they should be dealt with. I think a consumer welfare standard has done so much good for rationalizing the regulatory agenda, both on consumer protection to a lesser extent, but certainly on antitrust, because before it becomes subjective, and then whatever is, you could imagine a situation where, go back, where you would get, if 3 out of the 5 commissioners think that platform X takes too much data. So like in the Facebook Bundeskartell decision, the German decision, they said, well, they disagree. Facebook said, well, we need this data. And they said, you don't need this much data. And therefore, you violated their equivalent of Section 2. I don't want to live in a world like that, where if 3 of 5 commissioners up the road on Pennsylvania Avenue can say, Google, you're taking too much data, that's a Section 2 violation. And then you have a cadre of plaintiffs' attorneys who could follow on acts with treble damages under Section 2. That's not the world I want to live in. I think the Consumer Welfare Standard has done a fantastic job at cabining subjectivity and letting us know where the goalposts are. So I don't think we need to revise economics.
It does leave, and maybe I'll ask Catherine and Randy to think
Yeah,
about.
can I'm going to fight back at your characterization because I don't think it's at all what's happening in economics. What has happened is that a few years ago, some macroeconomists noted various trends in the economy in terms of the returns to capital, the returns to labor, and there was that trend. And it seemed to be driven by the increasing prevalence of technology platforms. And so that is certainly true. And there are certain other economists who are more macroeconomists in perspective who have taken that shift in capital or shift towards capital as a reason to think about regulation. If you actually look at economists who study digital platforms or who study the economics of artificial intelligence or the economics of data, there's a remarkable amount of consensus. So I think what you're describing is a difference between macroeconomists who are seeing a certain shift in the economy and then people who study the micro foundations. The other thing I want to highlight is among people who study micro foundations, there's an enormous amount of work on inequality, and in particular, the ways that digital platforms affect distribution. And so I do want to highlight that. It's mainly academic papers, but to sort of give you a tantalizing detail, some of the papers I've been reading recently have been around the role of data in terms, if you think of privacy regulation, one way of reinterpreting it is that it's great for rich people, right? Why do you think of it that way? Well, because we need to hide our preferences in the fact we're wealthy, right? That's going to be data you can use to charge us more. On the other hand, who benefits from having it known that they have income constraints? Potentially those are less well off. So there's one way of thinking, that's just a very simple model. I can see that lady shaking her head angrily in the background. But it is a really, I'm just saying it's a broad area of discussion. And so I don't think it's fair to say that economists are ignoring redistributional areas. Indeed, that's actually where a lot of the research has recently been.
One last question, if there is one. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Roger Cochetti. I work with private equity and venture capital in the technology sector. And my question really is to Catherine and those, and really others in the panel. The issue of barrier to entry, regulatory barrier to entry, is commonly brought up, and it's self-evident, I think, that if you have non-discriminatory regulation, that benefits entrenched, large, dominant players in any industry. So that's I think stands to reason. However, why wouldn't the solution to that be progressive regulation, just as you have in the tax system? Your tax rate gets higher the more you make, or in the regulatory world, small business carve-outs are common. Why wouldn't the solution to the regulatory barrier to entry be, if you have less than 1 million users, zero regulation, 1 million to 100 million users, moderate regulation, 100 million to 1 billion, extensive regulation, and more than 1 billion users, severe regulation? Why does progressive regulation not solve the problem of barrier to entry?
I think.
So you asked me, so I feel embarrassed to speak twice, but I think I'll answer this by talking about a paper I wrote about app privacy, and in particular apps that are targeted towards toddlers. And one can imagine there is an area we really might want privacy regulation, right? We don't want our toddlers to be tracked. Now, what's interesting in the pattern we document in that paper is that because regulation is so protective of children's rights within the US, much of the development of these apps has flown overseas. And some of the biggest developers are in places such as the Ukraine. And so we've sort of seen a flood of data and children's app development to territories where we have a lot less regulation. Now, to bring it back to your question about steps, right? First of all, I think it's assuming that we're not playing in a global economy. The second thing is, as an economist, it's very strange to think about a series of regulations which are in some sense going to disincentivize growth, right? And one worries about, at the margins, how that's going to change incentives. But I think that's my sort of reaction there.
No, I would just echo, that's the first thing that I thought is, I could imagine if it's 10,000 users with the cutoff, how many people would just be at 9,999 and then spin off something else, and you would get, I mean, it would essentially dampen incentives to innovate beyond. It's just for the same reason we have certain doctrines in antitrust. We don't want to punish, just having monopolies is not bad in antitrust. Just charging a high price is not bad, and we do that on purpose because we don't want to disincentivize building a better mousetrap. So if you build a better mousetrap that entices, is going to, in its fullest potential, entice 2 million people, but then you think, oh, darn, I'm gonna end up having to now bear this huge regulatory cost. And then you would think, okay, well, I'll calibrate it. But then we get into these informational problems, and that's why I think antitrust, consumer welfare-based antitrust, is going to do a much better job at that than any ex-ante regulation that sets thresholds.
So, please join me in thanking the panel for their discussion.
That's right. It was fun. I enjoyed that. Nice chatting as always.
Good. It was lovely.
I quit after 101 and 102.